All right. So hopefully everything's coming through okay. Good morning, folks. Welcome back to the stream. And um, hmm, test, test, test. Looks like I'm having some technical issues. Just a moment. Test, test. Alrighty, cool. All right. So that fixes that. So good morning. Welcome back to another Sunday stream. Hope everybody had a good week. Today's topic is going to be miniatures in tabletop games. If you came here hoping to see miniatures, I am sorry. This is not going to be a demonstration of the use. It's just going to be a talk about why we use them, the pros and the cons of using them, what they have to offer, and whatever problems you might have using miniatures in your games. Let me adjust this camera here a little bit. There we go. Crazy. Yes, so professional. All right, cool. So, looks like we got a couple of people already following along. Whoever you are, please jump in and say hello so I know who you are. Link for invites onto the stream is at the top of the comments, as well as in back in the Discord. I figured this is one of those topics that might be worth having folks on to share an opinion on. Excuse the box in the back on the floor. Got a nice delivery of, speaking of miniatures, got a delivery of some MDF buildings the other day, and I was in the middle of a stream at the time and just kind of wanted to tear into them. So I just kind of threw the things behind me and called it good. All right. So while we're waiting for people to show up, I guess I'll just kind of preamble it. Got my Goblin Head Press shirt here. This is the swag I got for writing for a friend's startup um, gaming company. I don't believe it made it past the startup, but I did write a thing and got monies and t-shirts. So cool. All right. Squirrel is here. Good morning, Mr. Hermit. How you doing? I know you are a big miniatures guy, although I believe yours are more along the lines of wargaming. Although no, I mean you do have some stuff for miniatures, tabletop RPG stuff. Your 15 millimeter stuff seems to be based for single use. So, and RWB Bishop is here. Good morning, sir. And so I guess we should start at the beginning. So everybody who knows anything about tabletop games knows that tabletop RPGs were born out of tabletop wargaming, specifically miniatures wargaming. So the two go hand in hand, um, and it's a situation where you know those pioneers of tabletop RPGs were looking to spice up their war games with adding some extra character, and then so we get things like rules for magic and different types of heroes. And as time goes by, we get this idea of adventure gaming, and so those early D&D games went hand in hand with miniatures. Somewhere along the line, despite the miniatures industry kind of keeping pace with the tabletop RPG industry, there developed this idea that miniatures in tabletop RPGs was somehow a lesser representation of the hobby, or somehow lazy or boring because it wasn't in your mind. We got that division between theater of the mind and game boards and stuff like that. Um, and then nowadays we see this absolute like hyper manifestation of miniatures in gaming, in tabletop games, where we see the crafting side of things where folks are building entire set pieces and going for custom stuff to represent all their big encounters, and it's become sort of a side hobby in and of itself. Hey, Jason's here, Mechhead Studios. Thank you for showing up, and don't apologize. Life happens. I know you got a house full of little ones, and despite our best attempts, sometimes we do they do require our attention. I may go scrambling up the stairs here at any moment should a crash and a clatter uh, appear, because my wife is in the garage installing something and didn't want to wait till I was done with the stream this morning. As she put it, she's in the waiting room, and so she just went out and started. So hopefully nothing big, but if you see me suddenly bolt out of here, you'll know what happened. Um, anyhow, so yeah, that's the brief history of miniatures in tabletop RPGs. And so I think where we're at today, there's a good chunk of the community that absolutely puts miniatures and tabletop RPGs as one and the same. Like, you can't play D&D without battle maps and miniatures. And there's a big part of the community who's like, if you use if you use miniatures and battle maps and stuff, you're lazy because it should all be in your head in the theater of the mind. Which of course is cool, but not necessarily, required. Um, but a four set of dwarves back in 81, 82. In 81, 82, they probably still had lead in them that early on. I mean, they were always pewter. They were always a lead, other metals alloy. I think some of the cheaper ones or the cast your owns were all lead, but um, yeah. So my own history in miniatures, I guess, would be the next thing. So I have been a miniatures fan as long as I have been, maybe even longer than I have been a tabletop RPG fan. And part of that comes from um, the fact that, again, they came up hand in hand. Miniatures were there first. But I have fond memories of going down, getting on bikes, writing down, "Hey Jim, Sergeant Mushroom." Uh, I have fond memories of being, 8, 9, 10 years old, getting together with my friends on our bikes, riding a couple of miles to the big hobby shop and just spending hours sitting on the floor going through the revolving racks of Royal Partha, Citadel, Martian Metals, and all those old school companies, and just picking out what just jumped out of off the pegs at us. Um, it and what's weird is, like, this, even though we weren't wargaming yet, we still developed this sense of factions. My buddy Kevin was all about the dwarves, and my buddy Brian was all about the goblins, and then um, I was really big on the elves and the Sylvan races and stuff. And so it's funny that people complain, "Oh, these war games, you would play these armies of one race and da 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 da," but devoid of any kind of rule set and just left to our own devices, we as kids still gravitated towards, I want to build an army of this, I want to build an army of that. And we weren't even really thinking of armies. We just like, oh, that's a goblin, I got to get it because I have the goblin collection. It's that collecting mentality. But so from there, then I got into miniatures wargaming through Galacta by Heritage. And then we did use D&D miniatures sometimes in our games. Um, we use them mostly in a side version of D&D that we would run, where we would make dungeons out of Legos, and then we would run our miniatures through them and populate the dungeons with the miniatures, and we'd put cards over the top of the dungeon and reveal it as we went along. But when playing D&D, I feel like the use of our miniatures was left more to just having them there as a prop. Like, you would bring your painted character model with you, and he would sit there next to you on the table, next to your Mountain Dew and your Cheetos and your stained character sheet. And he would just, this is me. The DM might use your miniatures to put you in marching order, so he had a visual representation. I know one DM used our miniatures to be also an initiative tracker. Like, he would put a little numbered chits or something next to our miniature. Sometimes when combats were complex, miniatures would come out. But we really tended to play more theater of the mind. Part of that has to do with a lot of our games back in the day were not played at a table. We would play on the living room floor. We would play on our bedroom floors. We would play at a picnic table in the park. We would play in a tent in the backyard. Basically anywhere that you got most of us together. We would play D&D or Top Secret or whatever game we were playing at the time. Yeah, I think both Squirrel and Mushroom's comment here, I feel like a lot of people like miniatures, and they like them for the sake of the eye candy themselves. Uh, but I think at the end of the day, we're kind of we're after the theater of the mind because of what we can envision, but the miniatures do help. Let's see. Oh, Cal, welcome. Um, yep, Heritage Lord of the Rings. Alrighty, and so I lost my train of thought. Um, anyways, yep, Rifts in the Park up by Flowing Lake. I remember that fondly, Jim. Just sitting there trying to make sure that your character sheet didn't blow off the table and into the lake while, parents were fishing. But yeah, well, we couldn't be bothered. Anyways, so that's kind of a brief of miniatures in gaming, in tabletop gaming, and my experience with miniatures and tabletop gaming. What there is of it. I've over the years kind of very much separated my miniatures and my tabletop RPG to being very much two separate hobbies. And sorry, Jim Sergeant Mushroom here is a buddy of mine back from high school, and we lived in the same neighborhood in the middle of nowhere, and still managed to play a lot of games. And so he's distracting me with nostalgia here. So, but yeah, we used to play all the time, anywhere, whenever. I don't know. I mean, for a while, we even had access to a lake cabin through my brother's dad. And go up there on the weekend, grab a couple of bags of groceries, and just hang out there and game for the weekend. That was cool too. But had a kitchenette and everything. Anyhow, uh, and sometimes miniatures went with us. Um, it is. I'm gonna out myself right here and go on record. I'm a weird kind of miniatures gamer. I hate painting miniatures. I will do everything in my power to avoid having to paint them. I do paint them slowly but surely, as the mound of unpainted crap behind me and over there and down here on the desk in front of me will attest to. Um, I will go out of my way to not paint. I have sat down at my table and gone, I'm going to paint, and decided to sculpt a whole ass other miniature from scratch instead of painting. When I was in junior high, I used to hire a guy on the block to paint my miniatures. I would go through. I would get a collection of miniatures. Like I was getting those. Remember the old boxed sets of official AD&D miniatures that came out? Very bright colored boxes, like a green one and orange one. I worked out a trade with this guy. Like for every 2 miniatures he painted for me, I would give him one, just so I didn't have to paint them. I was actually proud of myself the other day because I finished a model. I actually painted a miniature in 2 days. I painted this miniature, and I was impressed with myself and got a nice dopamine hit from the ADHD for accomplishing something. It's funny, Cal. Yes, it's funny because you either love painting or you don't. I don't know of anybody who's like in the middle. There's, I mean, I suppose there are some people like there out there like that, but I have not met that person who's just like, yeah, I don't like painting, but I do it, and it's okay. I do it because because I want to get it done, and I'd rather not have them paint. I'd rather that than have unpainted miniatures on the table. I've never met that person. They're either like, I will paint my miniatures because I love them, or there's like me, is like when pre-paints were a thing, the idea jazzed me, and then I saw the results, and they sucked. Modern pre-paints are a little bit better. Um, thank God for things like speed paints and all the cheaty quick deals. Like I used to, when I do paint, I paint for the 3-foot rule to get it on the table, and to where it looks like a thing, but I'm not ever going to paint to have it on display. So, history of miniatures out of the way, my own history of miniatures out of the way, nostalgia out of the way. So why do we want to use miniatures? Um, I had a bullet pointy thing for today's stream, but it's somewhere on my computer and I can't find it this morning. And there isn't enough of this in me to go hunting for it. All right. Why? Because, like Squirrel Hermit said, they're pretty. They're eye candy. They're great. A lot of times they just fill in a blank, and that's the surface level, I think. For some people, it goes much deeper than that. Not deeper, a little bit deeper. We're going to kind of go down a few levels. We're going to scrape off that topsoil, and so for some people, it helps them with the gameplay. And I think this is where we start to get into the real reasons why you would use them in a tabletop RPG. The ability to visualize where something is, what something is, and its relationship to other things can be useful for some people. I do find that when it comes to tabletop RPGs, the shootier the game, the more useful miniatures are. D&D, not all that useful in a lot of cases. Most of your combat's hand to hand. You might have an occasional archer or a breath weapon or a spell effect or something like that. But cover and your character's relationship to that cover and the tactical importance of the board does not generally hit you square in the face like it would be if you're playing Twilight 2000 or Cyberpunk or anything with a more modern bent, Traveler, something like that. Interestingly enough, you'll also see that some of that sci-fi games have a history of very much presenting themselves with a tighter connection to miniatures, at least in my experience, at least early on. Traveler, right out the gate, miniatures of its own. D&D sort of just piggybacked on Lord of the Rings and traditional medieval stuff. Whereas Traveler comes out the gate and it's got miniatures. It's got 15 millimeter miniatures. Star Trek comes out by FOSSA. There are miniatures for it. Now, part of this is also companies knowing that gamers will buy shiny things and that miniatures are not just for the game, but also for people who want to be able to collect spaceships and all of that stuff. But so there's that second level. There's that the very surface level, eye candy, pretty stuff, shiny stuff. Magpie brain. Um, and then there's the peel back that topsoil, and you've got that tactical importance. Um, then there's kind of that really really deep level where for some people it is part of the immersion, and these are folks that no foul, no ill will presented to them or intended. Some people need maybe a little bit of they need a little bit more help to visualize. My wife, for example, uh, we don't play with miniatures, but I just assumed her brain worked the way that my brain worked. But the other day she's talking about like, she's like, I don't get it. Like just how your brain works. Like, cause she's one of those people who like if you tell her think of an apple, she knows what an apple is. She can recognize an apple, but her brain doesn't process the detail and the nuance of an apple. And so those people exist, and it's actually a brain thing. I don't know what his name is. I can't remember what it is, but it's a thing. And for those people, miniatures and dungeon tiles and stuff like that are really useful. Um, and Jim, most of those ships are available in 3D printing now, and Aiken and I have them all, including some custom ships that I made. But that's why I have a ginormous Klingon fleet. Let's see. Going to go back and take a moment before I go on to the next point. This is a good one too. Shaky hands and old man eyes prevent you from painting. Optivisors. Here, even just a pair of good reader glasses will help with the eyes. Also, bracing your hand on things. So, like when you're painting, find a way to hold. You know, to like, you know, it takes some talent. It takes some figuring out. But let's see. And that's another thing. Cal, good point. Minis don't have to be minis, but I think specifically we're talking about miniatures here today. Um, I think we've all used some sort of marker. Skittles, M&Ms, pennies, soda caps, whatever it is, beer tabs, depending on what age you're gaming or how legally you're gaming. Um, and so that's a thing too. Well, and that's the thing, exactly. So, like Jason says here, I mean, if you have a child who's got autism or any other number of neurodivergence issues, um, that may be a thing. But there are just a percentage of human brains out there that do not process information in the abstract the same way as other people do. All right, so in that sense, miniatures can bring to your game a greater ability to visualize what's going on, visualize the action. They can provide a very real context for tactics. um, Now for modern gaming, like with Twilight 2000 for example, we just went whole hog on 1/72nd scale uh, plastics for models. It's all of them you needed out there. Cold War era, infantry for both sides. Cold War era vehicles, easy enough to get, dirt cheap. Can buy them anywhere. You can go to freaking Ben Franklin out in Monroe, Washington. You could go there and they would have tanks and infantry in their model section. And we didn't paint them up all the time. Um, Jim will probably remember the phase we went through where we were buying up all of the Dragon sets of the 1/35th scale modern special forces and infantry for doing more close-in combat CQB kind of stuff for that. So miniatures are not always lead miniatures. I mean, there are plenty of army men and stuff out there, plastic. Some of the earliest D&D miniatures were those plastic, China monsters. They call them what are the China monsters, where you get the rust monster and the owlbear from and all of that. And so it's you know miniatures can be a lot of things you scribble on paper and put on there out there, little fold ups. They now have a lot of like the plastic 2Ds that are out there that are done in art style. Marvel Superheroes, the face rip game, had wonderful sets of paper pyramid foldies for a lot of the characters. Like modules would come with a page of like the old fold out, cardboard, TSR style. You might one of those fold outs would be one that you'd cut off and then cut out, and it would be your cardboard standees. Um, yeah, and so that is what miniatures do for you. Um, Beyond being just a fun hobby in and of themselves to some people, and you know who you are, crazy folks, don't trust them. But it also provides some useful gameplay. The cons, now let's really sweep away all the good stuff and forget about all that good stuff. The negatives of miniatures gaming is logistically, it adds a whole new level to your game. If you are a gamer who's going to heavily use miniatures, then you are signing on to forever be collecting more miniatures to represent the things on your games to one degree or another. Some people will still be very representational, um, and some people will want specifically the things that they're going to encounter. And this has some problems with it. One of the problems that I have when I think about that, and when I've talked to some people about it, is not being able to play at the speed of your imagination. If you are invested in the use of physical props, whether that's miniatures or terrain or actual table props, you are always going to be hindered by the speed at which you can get those things completed. And your enjoyment of the game will likely be tied up in not only the availability of those things, but your ability to do them, and then also the quality to do them. So, for example, let's say you're going to be running Call of Cthulhu and you want to hand out some physical props. You have to, A, get the props done, but also those props have to live up to your expectations. So you are inviting another layer of frustration, potential frustration to the game. Let's say you go through all this trouble to make these props and they land flat. That's a level of disappointment you would not have if you would have just typed out that letter on Word and printed it and just said, "This is the letter you find," as opposed to like going through the trouble of handwriting it and staining it with tea and putting it in an aged envelope with a period stamp and postmark. No, um, you're gonna fall flat. Let's see. Gonna take a couple of things here. This is one of the things I really like about current 3D is because Star Wars Legion is a thing, but the Star Wars universe is much bigger than Star Wars Legion will ever produce. There are tons of people producing stuff from the Star Wars universe in miniature, as well as original stuff that they've created in miniature, which allows me then to have miniatures for my Star Wars games, um, both miniature gaming and for representation on the tabletop. Um, so that's one of the big cons, is just having to feel like you always have to have a set of miniatures ready to go for the things that you want on your table, and that your terrain, you have to have terrain. The other part of that, the other con, um, and this may actually be at the top, may be above that last one, is that's a separate budgetary concern for your hobby. Gaming books, despite their price, are in and done. You buy it, you can use it however many times you want without having to buy more to continue doing it. And there's always supplements and stuff like that, but each supplement's going to get you way more. When you're buying, when you're using miniatures, that's a whole other purchase stream. Hey, John, welcome to Old Geek. Um, when you're buying miniatures, that's more money you have to invest into your hobby to make it work the way that you want. That's assuming you are a I must have miniatures on the table kind of a gamer. Um, uh, so that's another concern. The where I was going to go before that one popped into my head is another con for having miniatures, using miniatures heavily in your games, is it can, and I will say very likely will, inform your creativity. You will start to think in terms of what I have, what I can build, rather than what I can imagine. Um, and I think anybody who says that they don't is probably either any combination of the following: well off enough to be able to afford whatever miniatures they need, an amazing crafter, painter, builder who can get stuff done at whatever speed they need to, uh, and or lying to themselves. Um, because if all you have terrain wise is some cave tiles and some village stuff and some wilderness stuff, I mean, that seems like the basics. Like, oh well, isn't that where all D&D takes place? Yes, but it will probably take place with the same dozen town buildings, the same existing cave tiles. The wilderness will get mixed around, but what's the likelihood of running into that new and interesting thing in those games? Now, granted, that builds off of itself. I'm just saying that it's going to very likely inform your decision making when you're running games. What do I have? What can I get on the table? Hey, Echo, welcome. All right. Just a quick reminder, if anybody wants to come onto the stream and yammer with me, the link is at the top of the stream. I will go ahead and redo it just to get it a little bit further down here so folks don't have to go hunting for it. But yeah, so pros and cons. So yeah, RW Bishop. I always want to say RJ Bishop for whatever reason, but spatial awareness is good. But I would say that that can also be achieved with a piece of scratch paper and a pen, a dry erase mat, and some markers, an arrangement of Cheeto bags and Oreo cookies. For just simple spatial awareness and strategizing, you don't need miniatures, um, and folks have done well without them. We had for a moment 8 whole people watching. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, here's the other thing. I mean, I mentioned earlier with the frustration aspect, and this is a good example. Now, this is an example. It's not going to happen like this all the time, but the amount of work that you're going to put into creating um, uh, the amount of work that you're going to put into crafting and setting up the miniatures for these encounters is going to create a hope, a desire to have that count. And if it doesn't, it's going to suck. I don't care who you are. It's going to suck, at least to some small degree. Not only can it get one-shotted, like in Jason's situation here, but your players may not even go there. And if they don't go there, again, because you put so much all this work in there, is it going to inform your DMing? Is it going to inform your running the game? Um, are you going to tend to try to steer them back? Maybe not railroad them. You might, But are you going to try and course correct them back to that Goblin King? Are you going to try to quantum ogre them and have the Goblin King show up somewhere else if they didn't go there in the first place? I mean, in Jason's case, they one shotted him, which can happen. But at the end of the day, here's the other thing to consider too. After going through all the trouble to make that one encounter, here's the other thing. People are like, well, I can always make what I need. Yes, but that's time and that's effort. And those one off ideas, what's the chances you're going to use it again? How many times are you going to have have a Goblin King show up, or a big old Necromancer's lair show up, or a Lich's inner sanctum show up in your game? So if you're building with that in mind, if you're building set pieces, that's a lot of effort put into you know something that may show up on your table, look really cool, and then get shelved. You can mitigate that by thinking more in modular set elements that you can restructure and put together. Um, and that has its own pros and cons. But yeah, I would say that there are definitely things that are worth doing with miniatures in gaming, and then they can go way too far. Let's see. Yes, the pub quizzes. All right, cool. Yeah, and this is kind of one of the points I was making too. Is like if you are thinking in terms of what you can put on the table, and your players want to do what players do, uh, it's it's going to be you're going to be fighting in your head over that. Now, that's not everybody. I'm talking about what can go wrong. I mean, these are all possibilities. It's very possible also that you are going to be balanced enough in your gaming to where you're like, hey, I love having miniatures on the table, but if you guys don't go with what I had planned, that is totally cool, and I'll just roll with it. You know, you're fighting kobolds, and I don't have any kobold miniatures. Okay, these goblins, these are all kobolds, or these giant rats, these are just all kobolds. Just that's I think that's a healthy way to game with miniatures if you're going to use them. That way you keep from feeling like, oh man, I suck because I don't have everything. Uh yeah, it's yeah, practicality is another thing. Miniatures and terrain take space. I spent the last year accumulating cabinets and shelves for my new basement space to put all my stuff in it. And as soon as I got it all in place, it was full and I needed more right away. So, I mean, I already need more storage, even though I now have stuff on shelves and in cabinets and stuff instead of in boxes. I still have stuff that I need to put together. I still have shelves full of boxes. You can see behind me there's stacks of sprues there because I don't have a place to put sprues right now. I don't have an organizational place for sprues. Um, let's see. And this squirrel, this is definitely you know a, a good point. Key encounters where it's important to know where things are is, I think, where the strong point is for miniatures. Um, you and but you don't have to have miniatures to do those too. You could easily do that again with dry erase and pennies. Uh, oh, I didn't catch this. Well, don't worry about it. You have real life to attend to, so that's fine. But yeah, so I think that kind of covers the basic pros and cons of miniatures in gaming, in tabletop games. Um, I feel that it's not a very complex topic, um, because it's either you want to use them or you don't, or you do use them or you don't. But things to consider. Um, yeah, it's yeah. So I mean, if anybody has any specific questions, we've killed 2/3 of the stream time already with me just talking about the basics here. Uh, I would say that before if you're starting out, try playing with basic representation before you play with miniatures to find out if your play style um, needs them. The last thing you want to do is go buy a bunch of money, buy a bunch of money, buy money, buy a bunch of figures, spend a bunch of money, and to go through all that rigmarole to do that, only to find out that they sat there on the table and never did anything because you were too busy playing in your head. Because clearly you didn't need them, but you bought them. So now, again, point of frustration, um, money that could have gone towards other books or other supplies you would use. So start with some basic paper maps, printouts, drawings, um, uh, cheap holiday wrapping paper is a good source of 1 inch square grid. The backsides of it often have a very writable grid on them. Go to the dollar store at Christmas, pick yourself up a bunch of rolls, and just make sure it has the grid on the back. And you've got all the dungeons you need. Um, you know, steal little figures from your kids' toys that they don't touch anymore that they absolutely had to have. Um, and play representational for a while. Use pennies, use food, use candies, whatever. Try that out first. Um, yeah, it's agreed. This is exactly. Um, if you need something more, look at options that are not from within the miniatures industry, like I was mentioning earlier um, with the 1/72 plastic model stuff. Dirt cheap, and for the most part, you know, a tank is a tank, and an APC is an APC. Um, at least just representing stuff. But you can have a lot of fun with very simple stuff. I mentioned I started actual miniatures wargaming with Heritage's Galacta, and in that set, it talked about using soda cans for elevator shafts and stacks of books as buildings and Tupperware for hab domes and stuff like that. So yeah, it's you can get away with a lot. You can go a long way with a little bit of stuff. Um, let's see. Yeah, and I was mentioning earlier in this stream that this is advantageous in some forms of game. Generally, the shootier the game, the more this is important, because you know terrain and cover and exact position matters a lot more when there's a lot of shooting going on. Um, Fantasy stuff tends to be a little bit more loosey goosey, and so I'm taking cover is usually all you would really generally need to do, or or asking the DM, you know, is there a pile of rubble I can hide behind to try and put something between me and the dragon's breath? DM will say yes, no, and you're good. You just gotta remember. And I guess memory is a good thing. If you're a person if you're a GM especially, who has a hard time keeping track of things, I am not going to tell you not to be a GM and be one of those people like, well, that's the wrong job for you. No, be a GM if you want to be a GM. Physical aids to help you are probably a good thing. Do they have to be a whole bunch of really cool, officially licensed Cyberpunk 2077, Cyberpunk Red miniatures with all the latest and greatest printed out with special effects, BS, battle maps? No. Um, it could easily be some dollar store GI Joe one pose PVCs that you've repainted to be Militech, or not even repainted. It could be Army Men, and you're going to have just as good a time. Um, let's see. I right before we moved, my wife scored a bunch of like plastic laminated two-sided two different scenes battle maps and a giant like I think's got to be like 6 or 8 foot long chess X mat with the squares on one side and the hexes on the other. I still haven't had a chance to use them, but man, that thing is just immense. And I got them for free. Somebody in the neighborhood. I'm like, I was kind of bummed. I'm like, huh, I've had a house full of gamers here in the neighborhood and I never knew about it. They were like a block for me. I'm like, oh, that sucked. But yeah, so um, 15 minutes left till the scheduled end of the stream. So unless anybody gets me talking on something else, we'll probably call it then. Um, questions, comments, concerns. Anybody want to come on? You don't have to show your face. You can come on and have just an avatar. But we I've definitely run out of stuff to yammer about without like harping on the minutia. Yeah, and that's the other thing too is miniatures can be representational. I mentioned earlier in the stream that some of my earliest memories of using miniatures in D&D was just to have a painted figure of your character at the table because it was cool, but also with DMs using those to show actual marching order. They would literally arrange the miniatures in the marching order so we could see them moving around. Um, or he could reference what they were. That way, he didn't have to constantly ask us either. Like, what was your marching order again? Because that's a big tip off. Um, uh, I could show off minis. I'm not sure my camera would come up with it, but would show it well. Like one of the ones I got on my table right now, he's not going to show up too well. It's an old Reaper Bones Owlbear mini, um, and I've base coated in black. I actually added some. You can barely see it, but I added some static grass to his head and shoulders before I painted him because I plan to paint him. He doesn't look much like an owl, so I'm going to paint him as like a giant raven monster. Um, and so I'm working on that. I always got some other stuff. Uh, got Here's an Inquisitor conversion of a Reaper. I'm doing an Inquisitor conversion out of a Reaper miniature. Damn, the lighting in here sucks. Where's the focal point? But this is a Reaper Bones miniature that had a big old steam powered fist that I cut the steam pack off of the back of him and gave him like a inquisitorial wizard head and a big old beard. I was kind of channeling my inner Ralph Bakshi on that one. Um, but uh, 3D printing opened a whole world of miniatures. 3D printing is an interesting aspect. It brings some interesting aspects to miniatures production as a whole. One of the things that limits traditional miniatures is what you can successfully mold and cast and the ease by which you can do so and the ease by which the end user can put them together. Complex models often have to be cut into many pieces to be able to fit into a to be able to mold register properly in a mold and then produce manufacture correctly, which then requires assembly and stuff. 3D printing, you can take very complex miniatures and print them in one piece size, of course, standing in the size of your print bed. There are things that there are miniatures you can make for 3D printing that would never be doable as traditional manufactured miniatures. Um, let's see. So some of my favorite physical mapping bits back in the day. Um, there was a cardboard set of full color dungeon tiles, and they were so evocative. Those really got used by us, and they were 25 millimeter scale. We used those a lot back in the day, and way before I met you, Jim, back when I was, in grade school and early junior high when I was playing. But yeah, it was a box, and you had to cut them out, and then they were, you have hallways that you would put in line with each other, and they were just fully colored and really pretty. And I can't remember what they were called or where I got them, and they were probably expensive as hell at the time. We always look at those old prices. Oh, the Monster Manual only cost me $8 back in the day. Um, uh, yeah, except for $8 in 1980s money was about $32 today's standard, and for a smaller book with lesser production qualities. So, um, I should, and I probably will. My phone can take some decent pictures. Um, I'm just horrible at the YouTubey thing. I used to do longer form videos back in the day, and I'm debating whether or not getting back into those. But those took some doing, and they were all done in like one take, no editing. I have no patience for editing. Um, so yeah, yeah. Anyways, playing miniatures with H.G. Wells, were you? But uh, but yeah, I should do more with the channel. I'm trying to build up speed, but this last year, moving to the house and getting everything or kind of set in order, just there was a certain level of stress, and that occupied a good part of my brain. Um, I I will admit freely that our move was done on the quick. It was done in a very jarring manner, and it came with a lot of emotional hang up with it. Um, you know, Feeling like I abandoned my kids. They're all adults, but one of them was not out on their own yet, and they were still living with us, and we moved, and they didn't. So it was just, there's a lot there. So this year, finally here, we've been here a year, getting comfortable. Things are starting to normalize. As those things normalize, I feel like I'll be my brain won't be occupied with things that don't actually take up space. If that makes sense to you, then thank you. I appreciate the understanding. If not, a good chunk of my time is occupied by things that I feel I have to get done or are important, but can wait and do not occupy the amount of space that they take up. So that has been a thing this last year. So hopefully in the coming year, um, things like doing more content, um, editing, or just doing those one take videos. I mean, if you look back through the channel library, I never got rid of those videos. I never hid them or archived them. Um, uh, I I mean, you can see what I used to do. Um, did I do it well? I don't know. Uh, I ended up the reason the channel ended when it did originally is that I really started to develop a serious feeling of imposter syndrome. Like I was talking out my ass, like, what do I have to offer to the community? Kind of thing. Am I saying anything that those other guys aren't saying better? With their snazzy videos and their editors and you know and stuff. But no, I mean, and then technological resources have always been a limitation of mine too. And part of that is because I have other things I'd like to spend my money on rather than microphones and software and computer upgrades and stuff like that. But uh do not want this stream to turn into a woe is me. But that is the reality of my situation. But I'm hoping that this coming year will be uh, a more enjoyable year with less hanging over the top. I still need to get a real. I mean, it's been a year and I still don't have a real fridge. I mean, just to tell you where I'm at, I'm living out of three mini fridges because refrigerators are expensive, and we haven't had the free cash since we got here to get that together. So again, my situation was quick. Like when we moved here, they had all the appliances except a fridge. Evidently, they liked their fridge and took it with them. Um, But yeah, if my voice can squeak like a 15-year-old's for a moment there, miniatures in gaming, they can be fun, they can be tedious, they can offer a lot of opportunity, um, and they can provide a lot of frustration. Um, I feel like once you go down that rabbit hole, you're seriously inviting the possibility that you are going to forever be needing more. And you're always going to be feeling like you don't have enough in terms of uh, miniatures and terrain and scenery and the like. Uh, if I seem distracted, my wife came downstairs to grab something. But um, like I mentioned, she's in the garage working on a project. Um, yeah, I mean, and it's a thing, I mean, that's like, for example, I'm talking about miniatures, but am I putting miniatures on screen? A lot of people are like, oh, you like miniatures, and my miniatures videos have done really well. But I don't have a setup to really do the flashy show off miniature stuff. Like I don't have good cameras and lighting angles and stuff to where I could really show it off. So it would end up being very frustrating to do live at least. I can do videos where I, shoot footage and then put a voiceover over it. But yeah, it's the evolution of the channel there. All right, guys. So we got about 4 minutes. I really appreciate all the folks who showed up. We hit 9 people today. Um, it it's not a heavy duty topic, but it's definitely one that comes up a lot. I There is a certain modern mentality um that miniatures and tabletop RPGs go hand in hand. And then there are places where people will flat out treat you like a heretic if you insinuate using miniatures with that game. Call of Cthulhu is one of those ones. People like miniatures in Call of Cthulhu. And what's dumb is that there's always been a range of miniatures for Call of Cthulhu. Sandy Peterson himself makes miniatures for Call of Cthulhu. So clearly the thought of using miniatures in Call of Cthulhu is not foreign. Um, again, what do you need at your table, and what can miniatures do for you? Is I guess the ultimate question. If you really want the eye candy, or need the eye candy, or need the representation on the table to help you out to enjoy your fantasy, um, cool. Then use miniatures. Be aware. Be realistic. Um, if you have all of the money in the world, then buy all of the miniatures. If you have all the time in the world, then sure, paint them all. But don't be afraid to plunk something down on the table that's unpainted and just say, "Here's a barbarian." Because at the end of the day, he's going to be on that board for what, one encounter, and then he's gone. If you want, the ones that are going to stick around are the ones that you paint. Yes, I get that. And, Call of Cthulhu is definitely one of those ultimate theater of the mind. But at the same time, I could see places where it could be useful. Um, Very few encounters in Call of Cthulhu are big enough to warrant needing representation. Um, uh, but I could see some encounters where they would be where it would be important to know where things are. But at that point though, if they're so rare, then buying miniatures for that reason, it's probably not useful, or not as useful as it might be in some other games. Because of course, fine, you had that giant fight with all those ghouls once. If you happen to be playing, see, for me, where it works out is I happen to be a miniatures gamer, so I have a reason to buy miniatures as in addition, to my tabletop games. So I have monsters because I play games where I have monsters, but they're not bought for D&D. But if I ever needed them, I would have them. I have more science fiction and pulpy stuff than I do anything else. Let's see. It's an app for the phone. You're one of them. They're iPhone users, aren't you? Though. Um, all right. So we are at 11 o'clock. I'm not seeing a hailstorm of requests or questions coming at me. Looking back through the comments, nothing else that needs uh, to be addressed. So I think I'm going to call it here for the day. Yeah, this is the thing. It's funny is actually here's a topic. So this ties into something that I saw posted actually about how posting work in progress for miniatures is actually harmful to the completion of miniatures. In that uh, posting work in progress pictures actually triggers the same part of your brain that that accomplishments does. So instead of getting the big rush of accomplishment at the end for completing the project, you are giving yourself little microdoses of accomplishment along the way, and those little microdoses can deter you from actually finishing projects. Buying and painting miniatures gives you the illusion of participating still. When you can't play, yes, it's sort of like that, if you those who can do and those who can't teach or whatever, and so it's a matter of you know make sure that the one doesn't take over for the other. I have so many miniatures because buying miniatures kept me in the hobby because I wasn't able to play miniatures. But I'm now at a position in my life where I'm looking at it and I'm like, I'm never going to get to use all of these. So, and I'm probably never going to get to paint them. I'm going to die, and there's going to be boxes full of unpainted stuff because I couldn't play. And so now I'm really starting to focus on getting stuff painted for what I play, um, and uh, also getting to play games that I already have. Sort of put a mostly a prohibition on buying new game systems until I actually get a chance to play some of the ones I have. Also, um, I have Pulp Alley, and I will talk to it. I will, preach that one to the sky all the time. That is a game system that can handle so many games that I would want to play without actually having to change system. But I really do need to be going at this point before I launch into another topic. Thank you all for coming out. We capped out at 10 today. Very much appreciate it. Folks who have channels, Squirrel Hermit, The Old Geek, Mechhead Studios, those guys I know have channels. Anybody else on here who has a channel, go ahead and shout it out in the comments before I part. You can see me on Wednesdays on the Old Geeks Midweek Geek streams, which I've started to simulcast to my channel, which is cool that StreamYard lets you do that. But and then Jason at Mechhead, he does occasional videos when he has something to say. He's a man of few words, but what he has to say is often pretty cool, and the stuff he has to show off is pretty damn cool too. Alrighty, have a good one, folks. Oh, and I forgot to say, I'm sorry, Squirrel. Squirrel shows off a lot of good miniature stuff, and he talks up Harn and Hackmaster. He is definitely on a mission. If he comes knocking on your door and hands you a pamphlet, it's probably a supplement for Harn. But have a good one, folks. And if you know people who would like my content, send them my way. And if you're not on the Discord, get on there. We talk about stuff, or I try. Have a good one, folks. Bye. taking forever to shut down the stream. I think StreamYards is broken.